Let's talk about the one thing most people don't want to admit when they're dealing with someone avoidant, especially when you've had enough and go no contact. You think that this will send a clear message, that silence will speak louder than words, that pulling away will finally wake them up, make them see what they lost, and maybe, just maybe, inspire them to take responsibility. But here's what most people don't understand. Avoidants are hoping you'll go no contact, not because they're done with you, not because they don't care, but because deep down they're counting on you to do the emotional labor they refuse to do. They want you to process the pain. They want you to cry, journal, spiral, grieve, whatever it takes, just as long as you do it without asking anything from them. They're silently relieved that you've removed yourself, because now they don't have to face what they're not emotionally equipped to handle. Avoidants are driven by a fundamental discomfort with emotional closeness. Their core fear isn't that you'll leave, it's that you'll stay and require them to show up in ways they don't yet know how to. They fear emotional intimacy because it threatens the fragile control they've built around their identity, control of their space, control of their feelings, control of the narrative, and most importantly, control of their vulnerability. So when you go no contact, it's not necessarily a disruption to them. It's a relief. You've just lifted the weight of expectation. You've taken the spotlight off their emotional absence. You've stopped asking them to meet you where you are, and they love that. Because now they get to avoid without the guilt. Let's go deeper. Psychologically, this isn't just about immaturity or selfishness, although, let's be real, sometimes it is. This is often a response rooted in early relational wounds. For many avoidants, connection equals danger. As kids, love might have meant pressure. It might have meant conditional approval. It might have meant losing their sense of self to meet someone else's needs. So they learned very early that pulling away felt safer than leaning in. That silence felt more powerful than engagement. That independence was their only form of safety. Fast forward to adulthood, and now they're in a relationship where emotional availability is a requirement, and it terrifies them. You go no contact, and instead of confronting their fear of abandonment, they bury it under false empowerment. This is fine. I'm fine. They're doing what they need to do. I can breathe now. But here's the part they don't say out loud. They're also hoping that you'll resolve it for both of you, that your silence will somehow transform into clarity for them too, that you'll come back healed, softened, more understanding, less reactive, more forgiving. They want you to process everything, your hurt, your anger, your disappointment, while they stay comfortably removed from the mess. And if you think that sounds manipulative or unfair, it is. But more than that, it's emotionally immature. Because real relationships don't work that way. Healing isn't a solo performance when the pain was co-created. But avoidants struggle with that truth. They avoid not just because they fear closeness, but because they fear the accountability that comes with it. The weight of having to sit with someone else's pain and not shut down. The courage it takes to say, I hurt you, I pulled away, I disappeared, and that wasn't okay. That level of responsibility feels unbearable to someone who's spent a lifetime avoiding it, or your no contact. It gives them the space they crave without the growth they need. And that's the trap. You think distance will force them to reflect. They think distance means you're finally doing what they hoped all along, cleaning up the emotional debris without making them touch it. That's why it's so important, if you're someone who's gone no contact with an avoidant, to recognize that your silence is not just an absence, it's a boundary. But it only works if you understand what it's doing and why. If you think no contact is a magic spell that will suddenly convert avoidance into emotional availability, you're still emotionally negotiating with someone who's not even in the room. But if you use that silence to reconnect with your voice, your needs, your worth, now we're talking transformation. Not for them, for you. And maybe, if they ever do come back, they'll meet a version of you who's no longer willing to carry their emotional weight just to keep the peace. A version of you who knows that closure isn't something they owe you. It's something you choose to give yourself. Because here's the truth. If someone benefits from your silence more than they ever did from your presence, they were never ready to meet you in the relationship you deserved in the first place. Let that sink in. Then act accordingly. Here's something that might sting a little, but it needs to be said. When you go no contact with an avoidant, they don't assume you've moved on. They assume you're missing them. They assume you're thinking about them constantly, checking your phone, overanalyzing every silence. But more than that, they're hoping you'll miss them without ever demanding they change. That's the game. That's the fantasy they lean on to avoid the real work of emotional growth. Avoidants don't want disconnection. They want safe connection. And safe to them often means distant. They want to be wanted, but on their terms. They want to feel loved without being asked to show up for it. So when you go no contact, they quietly hope that you're out there suffering just enough to still be emotionally tied to them, but not bold enough to call out the dysfunction. They want to be longed for without the consequence of being confronted. It sounds harsh, right? But let's get clear on what's happening underneath the surface. Avoidant behavior is usually driven by a deep fear of engulfment. The idea that closeness will require more than they can give, that your needs will demand their emotional availability, and that's where the panic sets in. They don't know how to hold space for intimacy without feeling like they're losing control. So what do? They pull back, they create emotional distance. But here's where it gets twisted. They still want to feel desired. That's the contradiction. They don't want to show up fully, but they still want to feel chosen. So when you step back, when you stop texting, stop reaching out, stop chasing, they're not necessarily devastated. Not right away. In fact, many avoidants initially interpret no contact as validation. Validation that they mattered, that you cared deeply enough to need distance, that you were overwhelmed because your feelings for them were that intense. And if you think they're over there reflecting, growing, journaling their emotional revelations, most of the time they're not. They're waiting, watching, testing the waters from a distance to see if your silence eventually caves into reconciliation on their terms. And let's be brutally honest. They're hoping your longing will outlast your standards, that your love will become so uncomfortable that you'll come back just to make the discomfort stop. But come back softer this time, less guarded, less vocal, more understanding. They want you to miss them enough to forget what they never gave you. That's not love. That's emotional convenience. From a psychological standpoint, this is classic avoidant attachment behavior. The avoidant template says, I want to feel emotionally significant to you, but I don't want to risk being vulnerable to keep that significance. So they idealize a version of connection where they don't have to be accountable. They hope you'll hold the door open, just in case, but never call them out for walking away from it in the first place. Now here's where this gets dangerous for you. If you're not grounded in your worth, if you're still measuring your value based on their response, you'll confuse their absence for mystery. You'll romanticize the silence. You'll think your pain is proof of a love that must be meaningful. That's the trap. Your grief doesn't validate the relationship. It just reflects what you invested in it. And let's face it, many of you gave everything, your time, your energy, your vulnerability. You showed up. They didn't. And when you finally stopped trying, they hoped you'd stay emotionally tethered just enough for them to still feel wanted without ever having to change. That's what avoidants hope for when you go no contact. Emotional access without emotional effort. But here's what they're not prepared for. You evolving. You getting clearer, not more confused. You using the silence to build strength, not illusions. They're not expecting you to wake up one day and say, wait a second, this isn't love. This is emotional starvation dressed up as romance. When that moment comes, when you shift from longing to clarity, the power dynamic changes completely. Not because you've hurt them, not because you're being cruel, but because you've finally decided that being missed isn't enough. That if someone wants to be in your life, they need to be in your life, not just in your head. So if you're in the thick of no contact right now and part of you is wondering if they're thinking about you, they might be. But the real question isn't whether they miss you. It's whether they're willing to meet you at the level of emotional maturity you deserve. And until they do, missing them is not a reason to go back. It's a reason to keep going. Because love isn't about being longed for from a distance. It's about being met fully in the present. Choose the version of you that doesn't just crave connection, but knows exactly what kind of connection is worth coming back for. There's this quiet, unspoken hope that avoidants carry when you finally go no contact. And it's not about moving on. It's about freezing time, emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually. They want to believe that when you walked away, you didn't really go. You just paused, hit a button, froze the moment in place so they could avoid dealing with the fallout, while trusting that when or if they decide to return, you'll still be right where they left you. This is the illusion avoidants cling to, that time passes, but nothing changes, that you don't grow, that you don't gain clarity, that you don't develop new boundaries or new standards. In their mind, you just sit there, emotionally stuck, silently waiting, missing them, sure, maybe even resenting them, but ultimately preserved. Preserved in the same state of love, hope, and emotional availability they once knew. And why? Because that's easier for them to imagine than to face the reality that you're evolving without them. Avoidants fear change they don't control. It threatens the structure they've carefully built to keep emotional discomfort at bay. So when you go no contact, they try to imagine the relationship as a snapshot, not a story. Something they can revisit later when they feel safe or bored or nostalgic. Something they can walk back into when it feels convenient, grieving, growing in their absence. It's deeply psychological. Avoidants often have an arrested emotional development when it comes to intimacy. That doesn't make them bad people. It makes them unready. It means that somewhere along the way they learned that real connection leads to pain or loss or responsibility they weren't equipped to handle. So when someone gets too close, when you get too real, they hit the brakes. And when you walk away, that's not closure to them. It's a pause button, a delay in the emotional script, not a rewrite. But here's where it gets tricky. When you do the hard work of going no contact, when you finally say, I can't keep bleeding just to prove I love you, you begin to grow. Even in the silence, even in the pain, you begin to change in ways they're not imagining. You start to wake up to how much of yourself you gave away just to keep a bond alive. You realize that loving someone isn't the same as waiting for them to be ready. That your emotional loyalty isn't a reason to stay loyal to a version of them that doesn't exist anymore, if it ever really did. And while you're growing, they're still holding on to the image of you as the person they left, the person who would have done anything to keep the connection, who would have waited, justified, stayed silent to maintain the peace. But that person, that version of you, is evolving every single day. They choose not to show up. This is the part no one warns you about. Healing changes your taste. You stop craving what doesn't feed you. You stop chasing what's emotionally unavailable. You stop romanticizing silence and start recognizing it for what it really is. Absence. And absence is not a foundation for love. It's a reflection of someone's capacity. But for avoidance, this is terrifying, because it means that while they were hoping you'd stay stuck in the past, you were actually building a future, one where you're emotionally met, not just emotionally manipulated by nostalgia. One where you're not just the person they miss, but the person they no longer have access to because they chose avoidance over accountability. Philosophically, this is a reckoning. It forces the avoidant, if they ever become conscious enough to reflect, to confront the truth that people don't stay frozen. People change. Hearts harden. Clarity sharpens. And sometimes, when they finally circle back, they find a version of you that's no longer interested in the fantasy they tried to preserve. That's why your healing is not just personal, it's disruptive. It shatters the illusion they clung to. It confronts the avoidant with something they never expected. That your silence wasn't passive, it was powerful. And it moved you forward, not backward. So here's what I want you to take from this. You are not frozen in time. You are not waiting. You are not a chapter they get to reread at their convenience. You are the author of your own story now. And if they ever return hoping to pick up where they left off, let your growth be the reminder that time didn't stand still. You didn't. Let's get really honest about something. When you go no contact with an avoidant, one of the things they're secretly hoping for is that time and silence will somehow reset the story. They want the slate wiped clean. No conflict, no uncomfortable conversations, no emotional accountability. Just a quiet hope that enough time will blur the edges of what really happened. Not for them, but for you. Avoidants don't like rupture, not because they care deeply about the damage it causes, but because rupture demands repair. And repair requires vulnerability. It requires words they don't want to say. It requires stepping into discomfort, admitting fault, and tolerating the emotional intensity of another human being. So instead of repairing, they retreat. And then they wait, not always consciously, but definitely with intention. They're hoping your memory will soften, that the truth you were burning with when you walked away will fade into something more palatable, something they can manage, something they can re-enter without ever truly reckoning with what broke you in the first place. This is emotional avoidance at its most strategic. It's not that they don't know you were hurt. They do. It's that they're hoping time will make you forget how deeply, that the emotional charge you once carried will weaken just enough for them to show up later and rewrite the ending. Psychologically, this comes down to narrative control. Avoidants often have a fractured relationship with conflict resolution. Somewhere along the way, they learn that facing hard emotions, either their own or someone else's, was dangerous. Maybe in their family, conflict was explosive or shameful. Maybe it always ended in withdrawal or rejection. So they learn to distance, repress, and reset, rather than engage, feel, and repair. So now, as adults, when intimacy gets messy, which it always does, they default to the only thing they know: disappear, create space, hope it passes, hope you pass. And when you go no contact, they see it as an opportunity. Now they don't have to be the one who stepped away. You did. Now they can frame it however they want. You needed time. You were emotional. You pulled back first. And they're hoping that by the time you reconnect, if you do, the pain will have dulled just enough for you to avoid bringing it all up again. Let's be really clear. This is not healing. This is deflection, dressed up as closure. It's a silent tactic that lets them sidestep the hard stuff while still leaving the door cracked open. And if you're not careful, you'll walk back through that door thinking they've done the work, when really, all they've done is outweighed your anger. And that's the part you need to see clearly. Avoidants often confuse the passing of time with resolution. They think if no one talks about it, it's not real. If no one brings it up, it didn't matter. That silence equals peace, not avoidance. But here's the truth. Silence is not resolution. It's just unspoken pain. And if you go back under those terms, if you reunite without clarity, without repair, without real accountability, you're stepping into a relationship that has the same cracks as before, just covered in a fresh coat of silence. Philosophically, this is the difference between reconnection and repetition. Reconnection is earned. It's rooted in awareness, in ownership, in change. Repetition is recycled. It's the same dance, just with different words. Or worse, no words at all. So, when an avoidant hopes that silence will reset the narrative, what they're really hoping for is that your need for closure will weaken before their discomfort with accountability does. That you'll meet them where they left you, not where you need them to be. That your loneliness will overshadow your standards. But here's the good news. Your silence can be just as strategic. Not in a manipulative way, but in a clarifying way. Because while they're hoping the distance erases the truth, you get to use the distance to sharpen it. You get to decide what version of this story you're taking forward. You get to ask yourself, do I want resolution or do I want repetition? Am I walking away so we can grow or just so they can forget? Because the point of going no contact isn't to punish them. It's to protect you, to get out of the emotional fog, to remember your voice, to reset, not the narrative, but your sense of self. And when you do that, the truth becomes impossible to forget no matter how long it's been. So if they ever come back, acting like nothing happened, hoping to start fresh without earning that right, let your silence be the reminder not of what you lost, but of what you learned. And never forget this: time doesn't heal what accountability refuses to touch.